Okay, today I'm going to demonstrate how I make my potassium benzoate whistle fuel. And the reason for that is because I make it a lot different than most people do. I use something closer to the military whistle fuel, where I'm using red gum as the burn rate modifier, and I also use perlite like the Chinese and the commercial factories use. And there's a reason I use perlite. I won't get deep into that, but it's basically, in this formula, it's more of a compaction aid whenever I press it. So anyway, I'll get started here. I'm going to start by weighing out my my fuel, the perlite, and the red gum. I'm leaving my oxidizer out because I don't want to mill it. And this mix that I'm starting out with, I have to mill to get it fine enough for the performance that I want. So I start with this is just a 5-inch case former I use as a container. I put a bag in there, and I'm making 100 grams of potassium benny fuel. So I'm going to start with the potassium benzoate. I have my scale tared, and I want to weigh out 35 grams. All right. There's 35. Next, I need the perlite. And perlite, it's just a volcanic rock that's been crushed. Well, it has to be heated first. Let me see if I can grab some here. Okay, this is how I get it. It's a foamy, easily crushed volcanic rock. It just turns to powder when you squeeze it. This stuff, I've already done some milling to it, so it's already a powder. And I do that ahead of time so I can dry it out and make sure there's no moisture left in it. But in this formula, I need 8 grams. And the last part of the fuel is 2% red gum. There's 2 grams. All right, and this is my fuel mix. minus the oxidizer. I give it a little pre-mix, not that it's needed, it's going in a blender. It's easier to make larger batches, but I don't really need any. I just wanted to demonstrate how I make it. And this is a blade mill. It's a flour mill, and it's probably one of my most used tools. Why isn't this closing? There we go. I'm going to plug it in. That's really all it needs. I can feel the drum heated up just a little bit. If it gets too hot, the red gum will melt. I try and knock some of the powder off the walls before I open it. And when you open it, there's going to be some airflow dust coming off. You want to try not to breathe that. I have a fan running in the background to try and eliminate that. See, there's definitely some dust floating away. Okay. I'd normally be doing this outside because of the dust, but today it's raining. And it's kind of hard to film outside in the rain. Alright, that's good enough. Now, I'm just going to leave that there for now. The last ingredient is the oxidizer, which if you don't already know what it is, you probably shouldn't be making whistle. But anyway, I need 65 grams. And this has already been milled in a different blender. I don't want to use the same blender for oxidizers as I do for fuels. A little bit over. $65. Put my chemicals away. All right. Done with my scale. I'm just mixing this before I screen it. At least get it to look like a uniform mix. Try and break up any large clumps. Okay. Now the screen I'm mixing with is a 40 mesh Laguna lab sleeve or lab sieve. Set that aside. If I want really exceptionally hot fuel, I'll sieve with a 100 mesh screen, but it takes a while to get it through because, as you can see, it blinds the screen very easily. It's blinded, and I have to keep tapping on it to get it to go through. The first sieve is to break up the clumps. Sometimes I use a window screen, but I didn't have any clean right now, so and I run it through the window screen first sometimes just to break up those clumps, and it makes it easier for it to go through this screen. This is a live mix, so at this point it is whistle fuel, and it can explode if too much friction is applied to it. So I just lightly brush it just to get it to gently fall through the screen. That should be good enough. Now the reason I use red gum as my burn rate modifier is because it's very stable in the composition. It doesn't degrade it in any way. Copper oxychloride works very good. It makes it really hot, sometimes too hot for what I like. But over time it seems to degrade, and over time you can actually see the color of the composition change from a light blue to a light green color. And I'm no chemist, so I really don't know exactly what it changes to, but there is a definite difference in performance once it changes color. So because of those issues, I'm using red gum. And technically potassium benzoate doesn't usually exhibit issues burning on its own without a catalyst, but it does burn a lot nicer, makes a nice smooth whistle sound whenever I use the red gum. Okay, there's some larger mesh particles that don't want to go through. Not that big of a deal. You can screen it a third time, but for most purposes, twice is good enough. Alright, the next part is granulation. And I have a larger granulation screen, but this is what I use for small batches. It's nice and handy and easy to use. It's not exactly a normal mesh size. This is something I found at work as far as I have a whole bunch of this screen and I stretch it across the frame and it works good enough for granulating. I'm not trying to make black powder with it. I'm just trying to break up the composition into granules that flow easy in measuring spoons. Right now this can be used in a rocket, but the problem is it's real fluffy, and when you put it in a tube and you put a rammer in, it poofs out in your face. And yeah, you can use it like that, it's fine, but it's quite messy. So I go through the granulation process just to make it easier to use. And let's see here. The way I do that, I put the composition in a bag and I put it all in the bag and make a putty by adding alcohol to this. And I mix it in the bag. It's just a preference. I use regular denatured alcohol, and I don't need much. It's kind of hard to pour from this into the bag, so I put it in a cup. Like I said, I don't need enough or much, I just need enough to make it into a putty. That should be pretty close to being enough. You can see the color of the red gum come out as soon as you wet it with alcohol. Just make sure it's evenly distributed. And I'll wad it up into a ball. And if you want to know exactly how much alcohol I used there, let's find out. And 28. The bag weighs 9 grams. And I have 110. So 119. So that's 9. I added 9 grams of alcohol to 110 grams of composition. Okay, now that I have this watered up into a nice ball, I'm going to granulate it onto this and set it aside for drying. I'm not making black powder here, so you don't have to force it down and twist it to make it into solid large grains. I just want it to stick together in small tiny grains, and I want it to easily break apart whenever I press it, because I don't want hard grains. And the bag, these bags still have whistle composition in them, so I put them in a separate bag with hot or live composition in it, and I wet it down or I burn it. And that's how I make my Benny whistle fuel. I'm going to put it on the drying rack, and it may be ready in 2 hours, but I usually just put it on the rack and forget about it until the next day. And that's how I make my Benny whistle.